Hello and welcome to All Hands on Tech. I'm Jeremy Morgan. One of the biggest benefits of a web application is the fact that it should behave reasonably similar no matter what platform you're using it from. The look, feel, and functionality are all basically the same, well, except on mobile devices. Progressive web apps tackle that problem head-on. They are web applications, but they run on your mobile device. They live on your home screen and can access hardware, communicate with a server, and sometimes even run offline. Flutter is a UI toolkit that is thriving in this space. While some progressive web app frameworks generate code that's almost as fast as native, Flutter generates native code. Yes, Flutter apps can compile directly to machine code or JavaScript depending on the application. This means you can build performant applications for Apple or Android platforms with the same codebase. It's pretty awesome. Today I'm talking with Chris Sells, a senior product manager on the Flutter team at Google. We're going to talk about progressive web apps, Flutter, and how he learns and polishes his own skills. So let's welcome Chris Sells. So how are you doing today, Chris?
I'm good, Jeremy. How are you?
Doing fairly well. So how's the weather where you're at? I know you're not far from me.
For your listeners, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and it is typical Pacific Northwest weather. Meaning it is cloudy and rainy and chilly and generally terrible. It's not cold enough to snow, which, being from the Midwest, I would actually prefer. But it's not warm enough, for the plants to be, growing and green and lush. And in fact, summer in the Pacific Northwest is the best ever. We are in winter, which is the worst. So that's a really long way to answer your question.
Yeah. That's what I tell everybody about our weather. It's 9 months. It's miserable, but the summers are the best summers anywhere in the world, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I had a friend of mine bragging about. He lives in San Diego. He was bragging about sunshine all the time and the weather's fantastic. And I actually prefer the weather in general in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm like, dude, you got that annoying, super bright ball in the sky all the time in San Diego. It's the worst. Whereas in Portland, we have this cloud cover that provides, sunglasses for the sky all the time. It's fantastic.
Yeah. It's definitely one way of looking at it. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So I am a product manager at Google, and I am responsible for bits and pieces of Flutter. I work on a team of product managers, very talented people. It takes a village to manage the product that is Flutter, and I'm responsible for primarily the end-to-end developer experience, which means I touch on a lot of. For example, I work a lot with our top customers and clients and partners, making sure that they have a great experience. I spend a lot of time working on the general ecosystem as a whole, all our packages and plugins, making sure that the quality there is always increasing, that the size and coverage is always increasing. I am the product manager for our line of desktop platforms that we support. That kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff I do. In my day job.
Very nice. And so how did you get started in tech in general? Was it something that you always loved to do, or was it something where you started out as an anthropologist and got pulled into tech or something?
Well, it's funny. When I am somewhat lucky in that I've always been very passionate about what it is that I was going to do with my life. My earliest memory was I was maybe 4. I was going to be a magician, right? Sleight of hand and card tricks and, pulling rabbits out of hats. I don't know why that stuck with me. And then my father was a draftsman, so I wanted to be an architecture classes in high school. And I dearly, dearly loved it. And then I got my hands on a friend of mine's Apple II Plus, and that was it. I was all done. I've been doing computers pretty much full time since my parents bought me my own Apple II Plus, just like my friends, when I was 14, and I haven't looked back since then.
Oh, nice. I think there are some parallels between magic and development. I would say. But I've never met another person that wanted to be a draftsman. That's what I wanted to do. When I was in high school, I was pretty set on becoming an architect. And I took all of the civil architecture and even mechanical drafting classes. Like that's what all of my electives were in high school. And I helped with the first AutoCAD implementation back in, I think, 1992. And that's kind of what got me into computers, actually, was I started playing with AutoCAD and then started getting into computers more. But I've never met another person that was into drafting. I still use AutoCAD, believe it or not.
Well, it's funny. AutoCAD is, well, at least I haven't found the consumer version of AutoCAD, if there is one. I picked up Smart Sketch the other day, and I used to use Visio a lot. I have actually remodeled pretty much every home I've ever purchased. And at this point, I know I'm going to do it. So I actually look for houses that are weird in a certain kind of way, right? I look for good bones. I look for good qualities of the house, but I don't want to pay full price for a house. So I always look for things that need updating. And then that allows me to update it and redo it in the way that I want. So it works best for me by the time it's done. I kind of get to put my own stamp on it. But I do all the interior design, the space planning myself. I generally get the help of a professional to make sure I'm not missing, any cool ideas. But I'm there in Smart Sketch, making sure I have all the right measurements. And in fact, I always get professional measurements so that I know exactly how big everything is. Then I start, arranging things and tearing down virtual walls. And yeah, I still do all that stuff because I still love it. It's still really fun.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I'll have to check out that Smart Sketch. Because there is an AutoCAD LT that's available for consumers, but it's somewhat expensive. So I find myself drawing up things to justify the monthly cost of it. So I have several drawings that are sitting around that things that I haven't built yet, but I feel like I have to
Sure, totally.
to justify that. But that's pretty cool. So what do you think prepared you best for being so good with development and developing things?
Well, I won't judge my own quality, but the way I kind of have approached knowledge is that I've always considered myself a lifelong learner. Even before I was playing with my friends Apple, I was, my mom was this single mom, and she was a librarian, and so she would my daycare was coming to work with her and being at the library. And there's just nothing cooler than just hanging out at the library all day.
Yeah.
And I just read everything. It was fantastic. But they also had an old teletype machine. It had 120 column pin feed paper, the alternate green and white, stripes.
Oh yeah.
And I'm sure it was connected to the local university, some PDP 10 or something. And I would type in maze and it would generate mazes for me. I would play Hunt the Wumpus. I would play on the Oregon Trail, right? And I was maybe 8 or 10, right? When I was playing with this computer, and boy, that really got the bug in me. And I would just do all that. And then by the time I got my own, I considered myself a full-time programmer who just, went to high school because I had to, right?
Yeah.
But it was funny. But I started my career when I was 14. I was writing, interactive forms for data visualization and management. And then I wrote a report generator that used escape codes on my own Epson printer for bold and different font sizes and things. And that's all really fancy way of saying I wrote a database program to track my D&D characters, right? And I used used my printer to print up the character sheets to play, while we were playing. And so I've always, I guess the key, and I do this all the time, and I'm working on several projects right now along the same lines, but I always am building something that I care about, right? It's not my day job, right? It's evenings and weekends, but I'm always writing some software that matters to me, that I really use in my daily life. And there's nothing better for learning a technology for real than using it for real. So right now I've got a couple of Flutter projects, like real that I care about Flutter projects. And I have to care about not only, how do I make the Flutter project run, but how do I manage multiple platforms? How do I, pick the right backend data management solutions that work well for Flutter? How do I do distribution, right? How do I manage the costs if there's, backend storage involved, right? All of the concerns that a software engineer really has to deal with, of which Flutter is a major piece because I'm using Flutter, but it's Flutter in context. That makes sense. Flutter in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've done this my whole career, starting when I was 14, and that is a fantastic way to actually learn, technology in a real world context.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I have a silly project that I've rewritten in 10 different languages, and that's and it's pretty much just something to gather food items for my family, because I have a giant family. So when we have get-togethers, or when we had get-togethers previous to last year,
right.
We would, everybody would bring some kind of dish. So it's basically a potluck application that I first wrote in PHP, I don't know, 15 years ago, and it's evolved. And it's the same thing. Like, I need to build this, need to gather the concerns, and I need it to not break when my family members use it, because they're going to make fun of me.
Yeah, totally. That's huge, right? I mean, this is a real world app. You care. It matters to you. That's a fantastic way to learn whatever technology you happen to have written it in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So lately, there's been a lot of buzz kind of within our company, and people talking about progressive web apps. And I remember you gave a presentation on progressive web apps. Did you explain, like, for the people listening, what a progressive web app is?
Sure. So progressive web app, or PWA, or PWA, that is how the lazy people say it, is the idea that, when you surf to a website, you're inside of the browser, and it's very clear you're inside the browser. You see the address bar, you see all the bookmarks, right? It's a browser, but you really want people to be able to focus on your app. You want them to think about it as an app. And so what you can do is you can provide a manifest that goes along with your website. And it's just a JSON file that provides a bunch of configuration data, but that configuration data then can be used to signal to the browser, hey, I would like to provide the user the ability to think of this as an app. Yes, it happens to be built with HTML. Yes, it happens to be distributed over the internet. But I really want, give them an icon, and here's the icon I want them to use. And put it on the home screen on your phone, or stick it, in the list of browser apps, on your desktop. But really think of it as an app. And when people install, your website as an app, as a progressive web app, using either your desktop or your mobile browser, then they have much more closer to an application experience when they run it. For example, the address bar is gone, the bookmark bar is gone, right? I mean, it's essentially the browser that just impersonates the smallest possible frame around your content, so it looks and feels more like a real app. And operating systems have been adding more and more support for these over the years, and the manifest is getting more sophisticated in there. Over time we've added things like service workers for downloading content in the background, and keeping the allowing your PWA to be something that is completely offline, right? Even if you're not connected to the internet, you've cached the resources you need. You can provide an experience that runs on your device without even having a connection. So that's the idea of a PWA in a nutshell.
Very nice. And so what is Flutter for? And I imagine that a lot of the people that are tuning into this will be tuning into it because it's Flutter. But for those
Right.
who aren't familiar with Flutter, which is one of the ways you can do progressive web apps, among other things.
Yeah. So Flutter is it's really a UI toolkit or an app framework that is also an open source project, and it's an open source project that was started and largely managed to this day by Google, although we have hundreds of external contributors because it is an open source project. And it allows you to build applications that have several interesting qualities. One, you can take a single set of source code and target multiple operating systems with it. And right now we support 6 operating systems in varying degrees of production readiness. We've been at production readiness for Android and iOS for more than 2 years now. We released our 1.0 in December of 2018. We are quickly following on. Web is in beta right now. So if you want to build, take your Flutter source code and target and distribute over the web, you absolutely can. And then we also in alpha have Windows, Mac, and Linux support. So those are more experimental right now, but we're moving both web and desktop towards stable over time, right? So that it matches the quality and production readiness of Android. So that's one quality, right? A single source code base targeting multiple operating systems. Another quality is that the developer experience has been optimized for a tight, edit, debug, test kind of loop that you want. And we do that using a technology called hot reload. So the typical developer experience is kind of, I write some code and then I run my app to see if that code worked, and then I write some more code and so on. With Flutter, the typical developer experience is I load my app at the beginning of the day and I run it immediately before I've changed anything. And then I start changing my code, and the changes are immediately reflected in your running app. Because every time you save some changes, we hot reload those changes in your app, which considerably shortens the development lifecycle. At the same time that we do that, we also, when you're ready to release your app to Android or iOS or the web or Windows or wherever, we give you native code for that platform. So on Android and iOS, outcomes optimized native ARM code. On web, outcomes optimized JavaScript, and on desktop, outcomes optimized x86 code. And this is native code. This is a native app like any other app on the platform. All the Dart code you write, which is Dart is the language you write Flutter apps in, has been generated into native code. And at the bottom, there's calls into a small Flutter library to do the actual rendering. And those calls are essentially, a wrapper around the underlying access to the GPU, right? So you have optimized, fully native, full, whatever the native frames per second that the device provides, 60, 90, 120, scrolling that's smooth and matches the platform, animation that's jank free, the, high speed video playback, all of those things you want. The native experience. It's a native app like any other native app for that platform.
Yeah, which is really cool because that's usually that was the trade-off. As you know, earlier, a lot of different companies and organizations have tried to make the one code run anywhere type model work, and a lot of times it'll run in this runtime and don't build games with it. I can remember hearing that quite a few times with certain frameworks years ago, like, don't try to build games with it. If you're going to do games, you better go back to native, on each device. And so that is really cool that it's generating native code to run. So I'm assuming the answer to the question, can you develop games with Flutter, is it's got to be absolutely.
Well, it is interesting you say that because the closest real analogy that Flutter has is in the gaming world, which is Unity. Unity is, it provides a similar developer experience and a similar library, but it provides native apps. And of course, Unity apps are known for being really fast and native, and you build high-speed 3D Twitch games with Unity apps. But it's the same model, right? It's an underlying rendering library, and then higher level code that is then compiled down to native code that makes calls into that library. You can, in many ways, you can think of Flutter as the Unity of apps, right? And of course, as you mentioned, there is a set of people, a growing set of people that are starting to build kind of casual 2D kinds of games in Flutter, and they work great. I mean, there are a couple of gaming libraries for building games specifically with an event loop and the whole kind of thing that you would normally see when you're building games. But you can just build games directly in Flutter too, and people do. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you mentioned Dart, and Dart is a really cool language. I don't know a lot about it, but when I first kind of dug in and discovered it, years ago, when it was going to be the JavaScript killer, I believe is what I thought at the time. But I remember digging into it and thinking, this is really cool. And do you think that Flutter has kind of evolved Dart into where it seemed like Dart at first, like this was going to be the web language? Do you think that Flutter has kind of changed that trajectory a little bit to where maybe now it's going to be the Flutter language and Flutter has kind of repurposed it, or am I totally off base?
Well, here's the way I think about it. I mean, when the Flutter, the engine came first, right? And all the widget libraries and the design languages and layout and the rendering and all of that came second. But it was really this optimized drawing engine that came first, that worked in a multi-platform way. And then the Flutter team at the time said, okay, well, what is the right language for people to write Flutter apps in that we can then, translate into calls to this underlying library at runtime? And they looked at a lot of languages, and they settled on Dart for some very important reasons. One is it has a JIT mode, just-in-time compilation mode, which enables hot reload. So I write my code in Dart, and we're using the Dart JIT and hot reload capabilities to give us that optimized developer experience. But also, Dart has a bunch of native targets that it supports. So when we're ready to release, we take that exact same source code, and instead of using the JIT compiler, we use the ahead-of-time compiler to get the native code. And there just wasn't anything that did that, right? You could either have just-in-time compilation, which meant you had a great developer experience, but a poor runtime experience, or you could have ahead-of-time compilation, which means you had a great native runtime experience, but a bad developer experience, or less, not necessarily bad, but not as optimized as you would get with hot reload and such like. And so Dart provided the best of both. It was really the combination of this, native runtime library, this optimized drawing library, and Dart, and all of the stuff built with Dart. The combination really makes Flutter Flutter. Dart is a very important part of Flutter.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that hot reload is like, it's impossible to undersell how important something like that can be. I know as a beginning developer, I did what probably a lot of people do, and you just lay down as much code as possible. And now I'm going to compile it. Now I'm going to run it and see what's going on, and then spend maybe twice as much time figuring out why it doesn't run.
Right.
And so that short feedback loop and the short iterations, I think, is one of the first things that developers figure out over time. Like, I'm going to just change this one thing and check it over and over. So with the hot reload, I could definitely see how that would make for a really smooth, fast developer experience. I'm sure there's times where you're still working on something for an hour or two and then checking it, but
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I tend to be a test-driven development kind of fellow. So when I'm building anything, that's not UI based, I build up my unit tests one at a time and make them work as I add new functionality to my app, and that's how I kind of drive, the logic of what I'm building, whatever it happens to be, and then combine that with, being able to iteratively build up my UI, and I can see it develop interactively as well. The combination is fantastic. It's hard to imagine going back to anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. So what big projects are out there that you can talk about that are using Flutter right now?
Oh gosh, there's a bunch. There's eBay built a whole new vertical for buying and selling automobiles, and they did it all in Flutter from scratch. They're using the same back end as the website that has been around forever. As long as the internet's been around, as far as I can remember. But what they do is they built a brand new app optimized on automobile buying and selling. So when you're selling an automobile, you pull up the Flutter app and you you can take a picture of your license plate, and it'll go from there. It'll look up what the VIN number is, and of course, VIN numbers are enormously long and hard to enter properly. And from the VIN number, it will figure out the make and model and fill all that data in for you. Then you start taking pictures of your interior, exterior of your car and the engine, and it will use machine learning algorithms that they trained to be able to say, oh, that's exterior, that's interior, that's the engine, and then be able to categorize them for the people trying to look at your your particular automobile. And at the same time, if you want to buy, then you can now search on all of this stuff. And they built it all in less than a year from scratch. And they had a fantastic experience there. eBay, so that's one. Nubank, one of the largest financial technology companies in South America, built their app with Flutter and had a really good experience. We at Google, the Stadia companion app was all built from scratch in Flutter, and it supported Android and iOS out of the box.
Wow.
With the launch of Stadia. And of course, recently announced was GPay, who actually rewrote their entire app in Flutter. And that was more than 1 million lines, almost 2 million lines of code that they brought over to Flutter. And of course, the same source code base runs on Android and iOS. All of the apps on Google's smart devices, smart device is kind of the ultimate expression of our Google Assistant, which, as you know, is a big part of the Google experience. All of those apps on those smart displays, those are all Flutter apps. That's just a handful. Right?
Yeah, so it's safe to say it's out there and being tested for sure.
Oh goodness, absolutely. We have more than 100,000 apps on the Android Play Store alone. That are built with Flutter. We have 500,000 developers building Flutter apps. It is actually, we continue to be surprised at how fast the developer community is growing and how fast the number of apps are growing that are built with Flutter.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So I know there's going to be a little bit of bias here, and that's okay. But how do you think it compares with things like React, Swift, other platforms that are kind of doing the same thing?
I would not want to compare and contrast versus Flutter versus any of the other frameworks. There's a lot of popular frameworks, and a lot of them, they have their use and their user bases, and they have their purpose in life. We are trying to fill a particular niche with Flutter, right? If you want, a native runtime, good developer experience, targeting multiple platforms with a single source code base, that's what we're trying to do with Flutter, and it's not just those 6 platforms, but there are other people pushing Flutter into embedded platforms as well. And we really want Flutter to be kind of wherever you need to move pixels around. That's where we'd like Flutter to be. We can't do it all, of course. In fact, 6 platforms is kind of a lot. So we work with customers and partners who want to push Flutter into other places that we can't support directly.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited about the desktop thing that you mentioned. I've got a couple of apps on my horizon that I want to build and want it to be the same on all platforms. So it may be Flutter, maybe what I choose for that when the time comes. That's pretty exciting.
I am biased, definitely, but I build a lot of desktop platforms. I tend to target in my own apps the desktop form factor. And a lot of times I'll deploy on the web with Flutter, but I do all my development on the desktop. Just because it works well for my scenarios. And so, I always end up with desktop and web versions of my app because of that reason. And it is fantastic that the exact same app looks and feels the same and performs the same. In those 2 cases, it's amazing to me, actually.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, what exciting things are coming for Flutter?
Well, of course, we've been working on the web platform, and we've been working on the desktop platform. We've been working on the mobile platforms, and of course, we've been working on null safety as well as other features of Dart. The language to come. We are very close as we record this to the Flutter Engage event, which we recently announced. That will be happening on March 3rd. And so I would direct you and your listeners to that event where we have some pretty exciting stuff to share.
Awesome. So you've kind of answered this a little bit in the beginning, but I'd like to ask, how do you learn a new technology? When you see something that pops up on your radar and you're like, I really want to learn this new thing, what is your process for doing that? Like crack open a book, go to Google, etc.
Well, I already talked about one of the things I do, which is, once I've committed to a technology, I start building things that matter to me. So that's, I mentioned that already. There's no better way to really learn a technology. But before then, as I'm climbing the ladder, I tend to kind of consume as much as I can. If there's a book or the book of the technology, I like to read through that. I definitely start, searching, getting started with, technology X on the web, and start, reading tutorials and, getting that kind of thing. Also, one of the things I love to do as I'm getting up to speed with a new technology, I like to find the podcast that actually, has been around for a while. And as that technology has grown up, what I like to do is go back in history and start a year in the past or 2 years in the past and start listening to those podcasts during what used to be my commute time. And I'm sure will be again someday. And what I find is, reading blog posts, even if I don't understand them immediately, but blog posts from people in that community and listening to podcasts, you kind of get a lot of the fabric of the history and the goals and the intent of the technology, which I find to be super useful when it comes to actually learning, the ins and outs, what to type to make it do what I want. Because really, when I learn a technology, I'm not satisfied until I understand what the core design decisions were. Why the API is like it is really depends on what were the goals the designers had in mind, what was the mental model they had in their head. And I'm not happy. I don't think I've really learned a technology until I understand the why for the technology, right? What that mental model is that the designer had. And listening to those podcasts and reading, skimming those books and those blog posts, you uncover these nuggets about, what the designers had in mind. And that to me, because once you've figured out the why and what, how it really works under the hood, it's much easier to layer on, oh, and this is the API for that part of it, and this is the API for that part of it. And that's those are trivial things, right? You can look those up on Google without too much trouble. But if you don't understand how something works at its core and why it was built the way it was, you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to, get it to do what you want.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. I've never thought about it that way, but yeah, thanks. That's awesome. So one of the things for the people listening, so I met Chris through the Portland area .NET meetup, which is called PadNug, and wanted to give them a shout out if you're in the Portland area. And it's not just .NET things. We do technology kind of all over the map. And after one of the meetups, I had asked you, Chris, for some presentation advice, because for those of you who don't know, Chris is a very good presenter, very interesting and animated. And so I'm like, I get some presentation advice. I'm doing a presentation next month here. And some of the advice that you gave me was kind of go up there and just go for it and open up the code screen and go for it. And I didn't take that advice for that next one, only because I was a new technology that I didn't know like the back of my hand. But then a year later, I did exactly that. And so we kind of had a little conversation before this about that. But what is some good presentation advice that you would give to folks who are kind of just getting started and just learning presentation?
Yeah, it's interesting. If I remember correctly, the presentation advice I gave you was, I think you asked, how do you prepare for a presentation? And I think my flippant answer was, well, I don't. I just get up and I start talking, and hopefully good things happen, which is just terrible advice. And I'm super sad that that's what I gave to you. Now, at the time, you ignored me, which was fantastic. And then my understanding is when you applied that advice, you knew the technology backwards and forwards, and you got up and you could just kind of off the cuff give a presentation because you really understood it. And that's a case where you knew the why, right? You knew what the designers had in mind. And so you could take the audience on a tour of, hey, let me show you how this works. And, tell them about, what's this for and why they care. And so in that one case, and this is the advice I should have given you, which is, you really need to know the technology backwards and forwards. You need to understand the why of technology to really give the best talk you can give. And my metric is, is when you know 10 times more than what you're actually going to say during a presentation, then that's when you can give your most effective presentation. Right? If you just know it backwards and forwards and you get up and talk about it, because at that point, that's really when you can start pulling back the covers and say, yeah, these are the APIs, and I'll show them to you, and we'll make them work, and I'll show you some code. But even more valuable to any audience is helping them understand what problems this technology was really meant to solve, so they can pattern match, do I have those problems, and how to approach it. What are the core ideas that the designers had in mind, which again is far more important than any specific function call they have to make.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I thought I'd just kind of touch on that because it's definitely a new thing for me, and I know it's a new thing for a lot of people out there. And now I'm in the advice giving stage where.
There you go. Absolutely, good work. Well, hopefully you give a way better advice than I did. And again, I apologize.
No.
I'm glad it accidentally worked out for you. That's what it sounds like.
No, it was great. It really stuck with me actually because I kept it in the back of my mind, and I'm like, okay, well, this Blazor thing is super new. I don't know a ton about it. I've only built silly stuff, so I'm going to over prepare. But then a year later, I'm like, yeah, if you ask me to open up an IDE and build a Blazor app, I'll just do it.
Sure.
Without thinking about it. So
exactly. Yes. Yeah.
So now I'm going to do it in front of people. No problem.
Yeah. And in only that very limited case was my advice accidentally useful. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you ignored me in general.
Well, I really appreciate it. So, do you have any cool projects you're working on right now that you can tell us about?
I am working on. I have been working in the background on since I've been at Google for over 6 years now, and I started in cloud. And while I was in cloud, I started this project that I'm still working on to this day. And over the Christmas break, actually, I released a big update to it. But this project is based around my deep love and passion for a game known as backgammon. And I don't know if you're familiar with it or not.
Yeah.
It is probably the oldest board game in human history. It's been around since, for 3,000 plus years, as far as we know. And I just really love it. In fact, I love it so much that most of my family will no longer play with me. And so I wanted to play with robots and a community of people that were experts. As I mentioned, because my friends and family won't play with me anymore. So
we had to have to build robots now.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm too lazy to build the robots, but I knew where there were robots. It turns out that since the early 90s, there's been this Telnet server that's been run continuously on the internet called the First Internet Backgammon Server, FIBS. So fibs.com, you go to fibs.com and you point your Telnet at it. You can actually log in and chat with other people who want to play backgammon and play in tournaments, and you play with other people or robots. They have people have built a bunch of robots that work with Fibs, and the whole thing is all text based. So the program will show after every move, it will show you a text representation with ASCII art of the current backgammon board. And then you type in your moves. I want to move, from 4 to 6. I want to move from 13 to 21, whatever, right? And it's all text-based. And it's been running since the early 90s. Very few people actually log into the Telnet anymore. Instead, this, set of programs that kind of have sprung up that, let you play has happened. And the programs themselves, the GUI programs, are of mixed quality. They don't work on the operating systems that I want them to work on. They don't work on the web. And so I told you I like to remodel houses before we started recording. In general, I like to fix broken things. Like I like to let my office get disorganized so I have the joy of organizing it. Right, I'm that type of person.
Yeah.
And so, could I have built, my own backgammon server from scratch and just, optimized it for what I wanted? Sure. But it just gave me so much more joy to take this existing thing that works just fine for what it does. It works great. In fact, it's been running forever. And build a GUI that I really wanted to use on top of it. And so when I was in cloud, what I did was I built a proxy. A web socket proxy, because if you're going to build a web client for anything, you can't just talk to Telnet, right? You have to talk via this protocol called WebSocket. And the WebSockets allows the bidirectional communication, right? This constant connection, which is what you need. That's what Telnet does, and that's what you need if you're going to have a real-time game with somebody on the internet. And so I built this web proxy that would, sit on a server somewhere and dial up to the Telnet and maintain the connection, and then it would talk WebSocket to the browser, and that fundamentally now allowed me to connect from any browser to the Fibs Telnet server. And I built a bunch of that. At the time, I built it in .NET, and I did a lot of C# back then, and I built it in .NET. Now, I've replaced all that handwritten code with a utility that you can just download from the internet that does WebSocket to Telnet proxying for me, and I don't have to write or maintain that code. I just have to run it somewhere. And then on top of that, there's translating all of this unstructured text into the results of API calls, because of course you want to write a GUI on top of structured data. You can't be the all of the output of this program was meant to be interpreted by humans, so it's all just text. So I built, and there was some starter code on the internet that I took and I updated, and all this is on GitHub if you're curious.
Yeah,
but essentially it turns the unstructured text into structured API calls and replies. So, for example, if somebody moves, you get a structured data structure that says, here's what describes the move. Or if you want to make a move, you create one of these things, you send it, and it's interpreted, and you get the reply back in raw text that's then interpreted into structured text. So I built up an API that does that translation. So as far as the GUI program is concerned, I just have an API to a backgammon backend, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, what I've been doing for the last year or so, and this is just one of several crazy projects I've been building in Flutter, but this is the one I've been working on over the holidays. I actually built a backgammon client that did all the stuff I wanted a backgammon client to do. For example, you can, it will show you all the available moves when you roll the dice, all the illegal moves. And it turns out backgammon rules are just wacky enough that it's non-trivial to generate all of the legal moves in any given situation on a backgammon board. So I did a lot of test-driven development there as I was building up my algorithm. And I have test programs where I have little ASCII art of a backgammon board as a starter state. And then I say, okay, I want to do this. I have this dice roll. What are this list of legal moves? This is what I expect. Does my algorithm give me that, right? So all of that, test-driven development stuff I use in real life. And so, my backgammon client is all of the, it shows all the legal moves. If you click on a piece, it will show the legal moves from that piece. The backgammon can be oriented, the board can be oriented, and different people like to have it oriented in different ways. So I press a button and it'll move everything, and it will actually rotate the board so you can see it. When you make moves in backgammon, it will actually animate the piece as it moves from place to place, and as you push something up at the bar or you move them off the bar. It does all of that, and all of that was Flutter. And that you run on GitHub. It's all built with Flutter. It all works with Flutter Web. It's all freely available. You can actually play a complete end-to-end backgammon game right now today. It's not yet hooked up to Fibs. I have all that code. I've written all that code, but I haven't connected the two yet. But that's my next project is making it so it can connect the two. Like I said, this is like 6 years I've been working on this on and off. So
that is one heck of a personal project. That sounds cool.
It's fun.
I'm definitely going to download it and try it out. Sure. That is really impressive. That is pretty cool. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Happy to, of course.
Very fun. And you can follow Chris on Twitter. And also, do you have a blog or website or anything you wanted to plug?
I do. Sellsbrothers.com. I started that. Actually, a funny story. That blog I started almost the exact same time the first internet backgammon server started. Back in the early 90s, lots and lots of blog posts on there from before we had things like Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Or Medium. Right. In those days, everyone, the software everyone built was their own blogging software. That was just the rite of passage. I have a blog, and I've, like you with your, your family food, your potluck app, I've rewritten my blog 4 or 5 times over the years as well with various technologies. But the current version is at sellsbrothers.com. But these days, I spend lots more time on Twitter than I do on my blog.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you for listening to All Hands on Tech. If you like it, please rate us. You can see episode transcripts and more info at pluralsight.com/podcast.